get a haircut?
I did.
They put a bowl on top of you and just
No, Katie was tired of Katie does not enjoy cutting it as much as she used to, so she cut it a lot shorter than usual, so she didn't cut it as soon next time. Which does help because it is pretty stinging hot. So I mean, I still got my little baby curls in the back, but
Yep, here you go. Oh yeah. As soon
all,
as I
all,
start curling over the ears, that's my cue.
yeah, all the ladies at the election commission said they're like, well, your curls are gone. I said, don't worry, they'll be back soon.
Yep.
All right, YouTube is good.
I've been enjoying my beard's been coming back in even this time. It wasn't as even last time, but since I shaved it off and tried it again, it's a lot more even, thicker.
Wish I could do that. Don't trust it.
Nope.
Not even going to try it. Not even going to try it.
Tried it again. It's a lot more.
There we go. We have sound.
Ooh.
We are good. Good afternoon. Maybe, I don't know, 5 o'clock. Is that the evening time? Welcome to this Friday edition of Walking Through History. My name is Nick Angel, and on the screen with me is Alan Seenestring, my good friend. And we are excited to continue our study through the book of Exodus this evening as we are continuing our walk through history. We have gone through the book of Genesis, and we have traced God's story of his people and his striving to fulfill the promises that he has made for them. And if we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, we read that God made a great promise to Abraham concerning himself and his entire family, that they would be a great nation, that they would come into possession of great land. And through both those things being put together and through the generations of Abraham carrying on, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And we have taken that story and brought it into Exodus, where God has brought down his people into Egypt, the family of Abraham. Here in Egypt, they have grown into a great and a mighty people. But now they're having some problems. That great number that they had in Egypt put fear into the hearts of Pharaoh and his people. They began to mistreat them. And once it's time for God to bring them a deliverer in the form of Moses, Pharaoh isn't so quick to let them go. And what we are going to look at this evening is something that is probably very familiar to many Bible students. If you've done much studying at all in the scriptures, and if you've gone to any Bible class at all, probably especially as a little kid, you've heard about the 10 plagues. We're going to talk about that some this evening. We're going to be covering a number of chapters, so we're not going to be able to read the text in its entirety as we are accustomed to, but Alan has found a great chart that is going to list everything that we're going to be talking about today. We appreciate him finding that and allowing that to be our guide as we just trace what God is doing here with the plagues. Some might say that these plagues that God brings against Egypt, they're just cruel. They're wrong, and God has no right to do so. But I believe the text shows us very clearly not only why God does so, his right to do so, but also what he's hoping to accomplish through these plagues. We're excited for you joining us today, and we do hope that this study will be very beneficial to everyone who is able to tune in, whether you are on Facebook or maybe you are on our new YouTube channel. Please feel free, if you have that link, to share that with anyone who might be interested and might not be able to join us on Facebook. Alan, thank you again for joining us this evening. Hope you are doing well today, my friend.
Yeah, doing well. I'm really excited to do this study. I've kind of been looking forward to it just in the context of our own plague that's happening right now. So it's been a little eye opening just to see how God worked here and kind of apply it to our current situation.
That is a great point. Thankful, hopefully, I don't know, maybe, hopefully it's not the hardness of anyone's heart that has brought this upon us, but I will not definitely rule that out based upon the society that we're currently living in and a lot of the difficulties that are facing us right now. Just want to make mention for you who are on YouTube, Alan just shared a link to our Facebook page, which is actually a video of his family, him and his wife Melanie and their little girl Annabelle. They do children's Bible songs, and if you go on YouTube and you search the 10 plagues children's Bible song in parentheses with lyrics. That will pop up. Little video that Annabelle did where she's the star, and she does an excellent job of playing out the parts in this cute little song they put together that can help people to memorize the plagues and to become familiar with them. Definitely invite you to check that out if you have the opportunity. All right, as I mentioned, we're not going to be able to read through the entire text this evening just because it is such a long text, and that will take up a whole lot of time that we want to be discussing the text itself. But we are beginning in Exodus chapter 7 and verse 14. This follows what takes place at the beginning of chapter 7, where Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they make the request to let the people of Israel go so that they might be able to go and make sacrifice to the Lord. We read in the text that Pharaoh's heart is hardened and he does not want to do this. But a key text for me, and one of the driving factors in all of this text, I believe, is what we see in Exodus chapter 7 and verse number 5. Exodus chapter 7 and verse number 5. I do want to bring this text before us right now. Exodus chapter 7 and verse number 5. The Egyptians will know, and I believe this is key, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the Israelites from among them. The question is, how is God going to accomplish this? What is it that he is going to do? What does it mean that he's going to stretch out his hand against Pharaoh and against the Egyptians in order to bring his people out of the land? Well, Alan, that question is answered for us pretty quickly, and it's answered following this very short occasion that happens here. This very short scene where Aaron throws down his staff and it becomes a serpent, and then the occult leaders of Pharaoh's house, they do the same thing. They throw down their staffs and they become serpents. I believe they're able to do that by the supernatural power of the demons. And yet, what does God do here? God's snake, that is represented in Aaron's staff, his snake turns and eats all of theirs. And I think that is just a perfect segue into these plagues, because a number of these plagues, they're not just attacks against Pharaoh and the people, but in fact, Alan, what we're going to see is their attacks against everything that Egypt represents, all the way down to many of their religious beliefs. What do you have to share with us from that regard, Alan? And I'll go ahead and let you have the screen right now.
I would say even more specifically, just the Egyptian religion, the gods of Egypt. I mean, this is, as I've read this again this time, this is a battle scene throughout these texts, and it's a spiritual battle, clearly. There will be a physical army later on as Pharaoh follows the Israelites to the Red Sea. But I mean, this is about as clear of a spiritual battle that is happening right now. And it's not, I say battle, that implies that, two people fighting. This is a massacre happening. This is God completely, just completely demolishing Egypt and everything that Egypt holds dear. They revere the Nile, so that Nile gets attacked immediately. They revere all these animals they see as sacred. So a lot of these animals that are a part of these plagues are turned against them. Their economy is just decimated. Whatever we'll see, whatever the hail doesn't destroy, the locusts come in and destroy. So just successively that destruction just increases. Their firstborn eventually are going to be killed. There is just nothing and no one and nothing about Egypt that stands after this. It's just like I said, it's a massacre. It's a complete demolishing, an utter victory by God in these 10 steps here. And we'll see. I'll share the screen here real quick. We'll see that. Hold on. Hold up, can't do it yet.
And now I'm actually on. While Alan is getting that up, let me make mention that if you are viewing on Facebook, that you can share any comments or questions you might have in our comment section. I have that up before me, so if you do make any comments, I can see those and we'll address those as quickly as we can. Thank you for joining us again this evening, and I hope this as I mentioned, is going to be very beneficial to each and every one of us. Alan has this on the screen now. Alan, why don't you get into this? And first of all, we're going to see, you mentioned something about Egypt and the Nile. If you ask anybody maybe in the world, if they know anything about Egypt, what do you know about Egypt? Some of the first things that are going to come to mind are probably the pyramids, maybe the Sphinx, pharaohs, mummies. But I believe one of the things at the very top of that list is going to be the Nile. And what is the very first thing that is touched by God in the plagues? It is this Nile, which in a sense is very much the lifeblood of Egypt.
Oh yeah, and you can see. I mean, this is a separate study that can be beneficial. Just kind of studying these gods of Egypt and their religion. It's pretty interesting to do, but you don't have to do that. But you can see all these names up there. Names that we would have a hard time pronouncing, but they were very polytheistic. And of course, they viewed Pharaoh as a god as well. Pharaoh was basically a god in human form. Mm-hmm. So he viewed himself that way as well. Right. But all of these gods were, represented typically by some sort of animal form. So, the fly god or other things. The moon god, the sun god. Mm-hmm. So when you think about it, if something is happening, what in the biblical narrative, if you've got an issue, like you're not getting any rain, well, what would you do? Something happened with the rain god and he's angry. So you go and sacrifice to him, do whatever you're supposed to do. And then the rain god is satisfied and he sends rain. That was the mindset of everyone outside of Israel.
Right.
So when these things started happening, the Egyptians naturally would start to, the priests and all them would do their thing. They'd start to pray or sacrifice or do whatever, and nothing happens. The water still turned to blood. I mean, the frogs were still there. The only thing that would remove these plagues was Pharaoh begged Moses, and Moses appealed to God, and God removed them.
But something I saw this time, Alan, that I had not noticed before, and you may mention this a little bit at the end of our study last time, is that these first, I think, three, let's see here. The first two plagues in regards to the water to blood and then the bringing forth of frogs. The leaders here in Egypt, let's see, the magicians. So magicians in chapter 7 and verse 22, through their occult practices, they were able to turn the water to blood. And then later on in, let's see here, chapter 8 and verse 7, the Egyptians did the same thing by their occult practices, brought frogs up onto the land of Egypt. Somebody who's coming to the Bible and wants to look at it from a skeptical view, they're going to say, well, hold on, look at this. They're able to do the exact same thing that God did. But the point you just made, Alan, I believe is key. They were only able to replicate what God did. Mm-hmm. They were not able to stop what God did. And it's so interesting to me that once we get to the third plague, because they're able to do the first two times, they're able to turn some water to blood. They're able to bring forth frogs. But once it comes to God bringing life from dust,
Yep,
they can't do anymore. They don't have the power to do so. To me, I think that's fascinating. And the way that you're framing this as being God versus the deities of Egypt, I think that is exactly what we're seeing here. And that helps us to see this in its fullness. And again, I want to go back. I'm going to mention this. I don't know how many times. We can start a counter. Somebody start a counter if you want to. I want us to reference chapter 7 and verse 5, that the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And in fact, what we're going to see later on is it's not just God saying that I want the Egyptians to know that I am the Lord. Let me see if I can find it real fast. Yes, chapter 9, Exodus chapter 9. If you have your Bible, you can join me here. Exodus chapter 9 and verse number 14. Exodus chapter 9 and verse 14. For this time I am about to send all my plagues against you, your officials, your people. Here's one of the reasons why. Then you will know that there is no one like me on the whole earth. Skip down to verse number 16. However, I have let you live for this purpose, to show you my power and to make my name known on the whole earth. God here is doing this not just from a very practical standpoint of making Pharaoh bend the knee in order to let his people go, but he's also doing this for the purpose of letting the whole world know that he is God. And isn't it interesting to us that once we get into the Exodus and the people, the children of Israel, come up against Jericho, and they send the spies into Jericho, and they run into this woman named Rahab. What does she say? We have heard about your God and what he has done. We are terrified. If we're looking at the Bible from a big picture perspective, we have to see that as being what God is doing here in these plagues against Egypt. It is not his hatefulness. It is not him just being vindictive. It is not him just throwing around his power. No, he is doing this for a purpose, not just to let his people go, but also for people to know, not just the Egyptians, but everyone to know that he is the true God. All these other deities, if we can refer to them that way, these supernatural beings and whatever power they might have, it is nothing in comparison to what God, the one true God of Israel, can do.
Are you able to pull up Ezekiel chapter 20 real quick? Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 8. Kind of a little bit of a tangent, but this whole episode we'll see is just an attack and basically a humiliation, a humbling of these gods. And as I mentioned, what the people of Egypt would have done is start praying, start doing whatever, and then when nothing happened, they're not just going to abandon their gods, but they're going to acknowledge, and you'll see as you get down toward the later plagues, that they start to, they're basically acknowledging that they're not dismissing the existence of their own gods, but they're acknowledging that the God of the Hebrews is greater. So they're like, well, our gods can't win, so whatever we got to do to get rid of this God and get them out of here, he's clearly more powerful. It's still sad they don't turn to the God of the Hebrews, right. And then this is even more sad. This is Ezekiel, generations later, talking about the whole history of the Israelites, and kind of looking back at this generation. And it says, but they rebelled against me, were unwilling to listen to me. None of them threw away the abhorrent things that they prized. They did not abandon the idols of Egypt. So I considered pouring out my wrath on them, exhausting my anger against them within the land of Egypt. Despite seeing these gods completely humiliated, completely desecrated, completely just, shown to be just emasculated, if in a sense.
That's a great way to put that, honestly. That is a tremendous way of phrasing that.
And yet, those people of this generation that we're talking about, and then they were delivered through the Red Sea, saw all those wonders. They brought those idols to those Egyptian gods that could not stand before the God of Israel, the God of the Hebrews. They brought them out with them and were carrying them around in the wilderness. And that just blows my mind. So if you're ever like, well, those poor Hebrews, I know they did have it rough. They were in slavery. They've earned everything that happens to them in the wilderness over these next couple books we'll read. Man, they earned it. They earned every 40, all 40 of those years of wandering in the wilderness, all the death and pestilence and whatever happened to them. They definitely earned that. So I'd never seen that verse before. So it just kind of blew my mind that, they still held on to Egypt that tightly, even after seeing all this.
Alan, that makes me think of Romans chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing that pops in my head, that they have seen in this, what's taking place here in Egypt. They saw the power of God. They saw without a shadow of a doubt his superiority over everything that Egypt had to offer. And yet they still chose to neglect him. They still chose to not give their full devotion to him. And they were without excuse. What do we see in Romans chapter 1? That though we look around us and the power of God is clearly made evident by that which is seen, they still ignored God. They did not give him the due honor that he deserves. They are without excuse. We, being Christians today, we have God's word before us, and we too are without excuse. We have seen everything that God has done. We are able to read of all these things he has done in scripture, and we too are without excuse. If we don't have faith, that's not because of God's fault. That's not God's fault. He has given us everything we need here in order to produce faith. And that's what he's doing here for the Israelites. He is showing these plagues again, not just to free them, not just to punish the Egyptians for their sin, not just for the Egyptians and everybody else to know, but for the Israelites to know. For them to know this is the God who is the father of your father Abraham, your father Isaac. My sister-in-law is killing me.
She did that Tuesday.
Listen, I even told her, I'd text her later on, and I said I blasted you on our stream because you kept texting me during all this. So I'm going to get her again. She's actually at my house. She's visiting with us this weekend. We're excited to see her. But nonetheless,
you need to block that number, man.
I'm about to. Every time I get on, I'm going to set a reminder. I'm going to set a reminder on my phone of people I need to block before I get on here. But it's not just to bring the people out. It's not just to punish Egypt for their sin. It's not just to help Egypt and the world know that they're God, but it's also for them to know, for the Israelites to know their God, that this God, the God of their father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is the one true living God. They're without excuse. They from this point on, they should have followed him wherever he led, wherever his leaders, Moses and Aaron, led. But what are we going to see before they even get to the promised land? Complaining, grumbling, unfaithfulness. While Moses is on the mountain, we see their unfaithfulness. I'm excited to talk about the golden calf here in just a little bit. But Alan, go ahead. Please carry on with your chart. You can go ahead and toss it back up there on the screen if you'd like.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that word "no." I actually had gone through and circled every time I saw "no" or "known" throughout the text there, because it just pops up, so many times. Hold on, let me share that again.
Yeah, for those who might not do much marking up in your Bible, let me tell you, it really helps your Bible study to be enhanced whenever you just mark up certain things, different colors or shapes and such. I know some people don't like to mark in their Bible. I respect that. That's cool if that's how you feel. But if you're willing to do so, it really does help enhance Bible study, be able to make these connections, to see them with your eyes, and to make those connections really quickly. Go ahead, Alan.
Another thing I think we see is it's fun to kind of see how the plagues are organized. There seem to be kind of grouped together in threes. So you have like the first three plagues, 1, 2, 3. Then you have the next 3, 4, 5, 6. The next 3, 7, 8, 9. Which then that highlights the 10th plague as, I think, the focal point. So when you have this type of literary structure, it kind of works the same way as how when we looked at the days of creation. You had those 6 days of creation, and you kind of had some organization. 1 and 4 lined up, 2 and 5 lined up, day 3, day 6 lined up, and then 7 was kind of separate on its own, which in a Hebrew literary sense, that was typically one of the focal points that you would move towards. So you seem to have that here a little bit. The first 3, one commonality between the first 3 is that the first 3 plagues actually happened to the Israelites as well. So the water turned to blood. It mentions, we tend to think just the Nile. Well, it mentions all the water sources throughout Egypt. So, little rivers, streams, pools, whatever, everything was turned to blood, which one interpretation of these plagues is that, there's some scholars that try to attribute these to all natural, these all happen naturally, and just because the water turned to blood, all the frogs leapt out from that, and then from the frogs they brought the lice, and they try to use this not supernatural viewpoint to explain away.
The
it's funny.
What's the chances of all of these things happening in this short period of time? There's no way, and some of these things are just so unbelievably not related. How is anything going to affect hail and thunder and lightning? How is anything going to affect darkness? How could you how could it be that within Egypt of all the families it was only the firstborn that died?
Mhm.
I mean, there's no natural explanation for any of this. It
That's
all so clearly supernatural.
that's the cutoff for me. Like I can understand, okay, there's all these flies. Well, flies bring disease. So the next plague is the disease of the cattle. Well, that's how that was where the plague came from. It wasn't anything supernatural. Okay, I'll at least give you that one. But yeah, like hail, locust, darkness. I mean, at some point they just get too big.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the interesting thing about the last group, 7 through 9, is God even says, okay, these next ones are going to be even worse. He kind of warns them about those last three before the death of the firstborn. So it's interesting to see how those groups line up together. And then you'll also see that every third plague is unannounced. So plague
Okay.
one, plague two, it always says at the beginning of its section, go to Pharaoh and tell him blah, 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 blah. But then the third plague, it just says stretch out your staff and, do the plague basically. And then 4 and 5, it says go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. If he doesn't, then this will happen. Well, then you get plague number 6, the boils, and same kind of thing. It just occurs. It just happens. There's no warning to Pharaoh about it. God just says strike them in whatever way, and same with darkness. So you kind of have every third one is a little bit unique in that way as well. Um, I did like in the first plague. I'm just kind of jumping around
Go
at this
ahead.
point. So I liked in the first plague, it mentioned that the fish were all dead from the Nile, and the water turned to blood. The fish, they all died, and then so that naturalist viewpoint is, well, all these frogs, came up from the Nile. Well, they should all be dead too, right? They can't drink, they can't live, and they should all be dead as well. So it's a little bit like God is creating the frogs out of this. It doesn't say it in the text, but it's not as explicit as the lice. I like that you mentioned, because that is a switch over. The first two, the Egyptians can duplicate. But as soon as God is creating something from a completely different thing, he created lice from the dust. Well, that's when they cannot create something from nothing or create
Mhm.
something from another thing. So these lice were definitely a switchover, and even the magicians and the priests and the bigwigs of Egypt even admit in chapter 8 verse 19, this
Right.
is the finger of God.
Mm-hmm.
So they start to see what's going on, but Pharaoh's heart was still hard. And then, of course, in 4, 5, and 6, you have a switchover. Now you have a separation between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The Egyptians are the ones that are afflicted by the plagues, and the Israelites are not. And I think it's the disease of the cattle. Pharaoh, I guess, hears about it and sends messengers to find out. And they say, hey, the all the Israelite cattle are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. It's only our livestock that are affected. So kind of an interesting switch over there. I like we mentioned how these plagues are basically an attack against the Egyptian gods. It's an attack against the Egyptian priests and their priesthood as well. Um, Whenever you see magicians and sorcerers, we see that written in our Bibles, but think priests as well. These were the same group. There wasn't typically a separate magician that just does tricks, and he was separate from the priesthood. These were all the same guys. So the priests that were in charge of the worship of these gods were the ones that were trying to duplicate these plagues. So these are the same groups, and it's interesting, beginning with the lice and of course the boils and the flies. It mentions, I think, with the boils that Pharaoh's magicians or his priests could not stand before them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two meanings from that. Could not stand because they were hurting from the boils is one. They just literally could not physically stand up because they were in so much pain. They were, doubled over or something. But I prefer to think of it as they could not stand, as in they could not perform their duties as priests because they were ceremonially unclean. The lice and the flies and the boils would have made them unable to perform their duties. Just like later on, if a Hebrew priest touched a dead body or something, and they were unclean. They didn't sin, but they were unclean for a certain time. They had to ceremonially cleanse themselves, offer a sacrifice or whatever. So it's the same thing here. That's why the Egyptians typically shaved themselves completely to avoid having any sort of lice or fly or little creature on them. They could more thoroughly cleanse themselves for their duties. Well, if think about it from the Egyptian standpoint, if the priests could no longer do their duties, as in offer sacrifices to the gods for the gods to come down and help them, then that's just another blow to the Egyptian people. They're already seeing all these things happen. No God is coming to defend them or to fix the problem. And now the priests can't even do the things that they're supposed to do to call the gods down to help them, offer sacrifices and things. So all of these are just, at least these first six are just, literally just tearing down this religious system of Egypt to nothing. And then and we're not even to the worst of the plagues yet. It's the 7, 8, and 9 that are, even more devastating to their economy and their livelihood.
Right, and think about just the boils in general. What you're talking about with them not being able to stand before and perform their duties. History tells us that the Egyptians and their culture, they were just obsessed to begin with cleanliness. You mentioned their shaving and things of that nature. They took a lot of baths. They were a culture that really valued just being clean in general. Well, what are we seeing with these plagues coming upon? Frogs, they're nasty things. Their legs are great, they taste good, but they're nasty. Lice, obviously, that's not something that we would consider clean. Flies are some of the most disgusting things in the world. Disease on cattle makes everything stink and be dirty. Boils, of course, is a great blemish of the skin. So there are so many different angles in which God is afflicting the people of Egypt at this time that we cannot but see God here asserting his power, showing just who he is and the power that he has over no matter what Egypt tries to do, whether it be the magicians, whether it be the priest, they cannot stand before God. What I want to bring up, Alan, before you begin getting into those final plagues, is looking at a couple of themes that I see here within the text, something that shows up time and time again. One of those being Pharaoh's response. How is he responding during all of this that is taking place? Well, if we go back in the text and we go back to what God says is going to happen in the text, let me see here. Let me see if I can find the first one. All right, so chapter 4 and verse 21. Exodus chapter 4 and verse 21. The Lord said and instructs Moses, when you go back to Egypt, make sure you do before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put within your power, but I will harden his heart. We talked about that a couple of studies ago. And then once we got over here to, let's see here, chapter 7 and verse 4, we read that Pharaoh will not listen to you. Okay, I believe this is a very similar idea of that, but actually prior to that, verse 3, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. So we have this theme working throughout this series of events, and the fact that it's thought by many that God here is personally touching Pharaoh and hardening his heart so that these actions would bring about a guaranteed result. Not guaranteed because that's how Pharaoh is going to respond, but because God is forcing him to do so. And as we look throughout the text, and as we just trace the number of times where this whole idea of Pharaoh's heart being hardened is mentioned, the vast majority of time, besides those first two, it is not stated as if God hardened his heart. In fact, we go chapter 7 verse 22. It just says that his heart was hard. Chapter 8 verse 15, that Pharaoh himself hardened his heart. Let's see here. Chapter 8 and verse 19, his heart was simply hard. Chapter 8 verse 32, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Chapter 9 and verse 7, Pharaoh's heart was hard. Now, chapter 9 and verse 12, we do read that the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. But not chapter 9 and verse 34, he again sinned and hardened his heart. Chapter 10 and verse 20 says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And we see that again, chapter 10 and verse 27. So if somebody's going to come here and say, well, this is straight determinism, that God is determining that this is how Pharaoh would act, well, that doesn't seem very clear to me, because it seems to me that part of the issue going on here is not necessarily what God himself is doing, but it's just simply the way that Pharaoh is responding. So it must be, because I believe this is the consistent way we can take this text, that God knew, he knew the type of person that Pharaoh was. As you mentioned, Pharaoh believed himself to be a god. He believed himself to be Horus incarnate, one of the greatest gods within all the Egyptian pantheon of gods. Horus, this great, mighty, strong hand of Egypt. Pharaoh believed he was Horus in the flesh. If God knew that was his character, a very arrogant, prideful man who thought way more of himself than he ought to have, if God knew that, then would not God know exactly what he needed to do in order to accomplish this purpose? I believe there's a great difference between God taking someone who otherwise might not have done this particular thing and forcing them to do it, and knowing that doing this particular thing without a shadow of doubt is going to bring about a particular result. One of them is God determining, God forcing somebody to do something. The other one is God simply using what's before him in order to accomplish his purposes. Pharaoh was a prideful, arrogant man. Not only that, he was a deceitful man. There are a number of times going throughout this text that we read of Pharaoh's deceit, that he lied. He said, I will let the people go, and then he would change his mind again. God knew exactly what he was working with. He knew who he was working with, and he knew how he could go about bringing about the result that he wanted to take place. So whenever people bring up this as an example of God forcing somebody to do something against their will, not so fast at all. That is not the case at all. This was exactly what Pharaoh wanted to do. He wanted to reject the Lord. He wanted to have things his way. He hardened his own heart. Alan, what do you think? Do you have anything to add to any of that? Because that's just something that shows up time and time and time again throughout this text. And
the
people
quote
so hard for that belief that God makes people do things.
Yeah, the quote I like, I mentioned it last time, but the sun shines down, it melts the ice, but it also hardens clay. The same sun does both. So I think that's a great kind of describes what's happening here. The sun is shining, God is shining down on Pharaoh's heart of clay, and it's just hardening. And it's the same sun that shines down on a soft heart that melts. But there's no difference there. God's will, God's word is given to everyone the same. It's just what we do with it, how we react to it, what our heart is made of. That's where we get the difference. And of course, here we have like I said, a heart full of clay versus the soft hearts of actually the softening hearts of even the Egyptians.
Yes, that's a great point. That's a great point, actually.
You mentioned it's fun. I like a passage like this because it's better. Like, it's good to read through it, and then it's also good to compare each one and see how they're different, and see each time what was Pharaoh's reaction. Sometimes he said, I sinned. Sometimes he didn't do anything, and just kind of compare each one. This one is interesting to see how the Egyptians and the magicians and Pharaoh's people react. You saw a little bit, they're starting to come over, and in the third plague in chapter 8, they attributed it to the finger of God. Well, starting with the hail, you actually start to get a separation from Pharaoh. Um, God gives them this warning about this hail coming, and in chapter 9 and verse 20, those among Pharaoh's officials who feared the word of the Lord made their servants and livestock flee to shelters. But those who didn't take to heart the Lord's word left their servants and livestock in the field. So you have some that are starting to fear the word of the Lord. And because they do that, they prepare, they make sure that everyone's inside. So when the hail comes, their property survives. And of course, some of them still don't do that. In chapter 10, you have the locusts and Pharaoh's officials in chapter 10 and verse 7. They're pleading with Pharaoh. Things are getting destroyed. Their economy, their livelihood, their lives are getting ruined. And they say, let the men go so that they may worship the Lord. Verse 7. Don't you realize yet that Egypt is devastated? So they're starting to turn against Pharaoh, pleading with him to let them go. So it's just interesting. You start to see this highlights, I think, Pharaoh's just how hard his heart was. Even the magicians and his priests that were obviously no worshipers of Yahweh, they are starting to see that what's going on here. They need to turn from resisting this God, because he's clearly more powerful than any that we can conjure up. So at least they are starting to turn, and we'll see after all the plagues and the Israelites are leaving, what do the Egyptians do? They give them stuff as they leave. Gold, silver, jewels, whatever. They plead with them. They give them money just to leave and get out of there. I think, what did it say earlier, that the Israelites would find favor with the Egyptians? I don't think the Egyptians were happy with them. They were happy they were leaving at that point, just to get rid of all these terrible plagues. So it's interesting, as Pharaoh is just getting more and more obstinate, the Egyptians are starting to soften a little bit.
Right. What you're referring to is chapter 3 and verse 21. Thou will give these people such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman will ask her neighbor and any woman staying in her house for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters, so you will plunder the Egyptians. And that actually is spoken about again later on in chapter 11. And this is leading up to the final plague, which is the death of the firstborn. Chapter 11 and verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. And after that, he will let you go from here. And when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here. Meaning he wants you gone. He wants you to get gone. Now announce to the people that both men and women should ask their neighbors for silver and gold items. The Lord gave the people favor with the Egyptians. And in addition, Moses himself was very highly regarded in the land of Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and the people. So yeah, God here is clearly showing, in a very pointed way, that his people are going to be protected, and he's going to deliver for them. And the second thing I wanted to bring about before I let you finish up by looking at these final plagues is another thing being God's care for Israel in the midst of what's going on here. Because somebody might think, well, why would the Lord bring these plagues upon in the entirety of Egypt? Because then his own people are going to suffer. Well, not so fast there again. We look at chapter 8 and verse 22. Chapter 8 and verse 22, in the plague of the swarms of flies. But on that day, I will give special treatment to the land of Goshen, where my people are living. No flies will be there. Chapter 9 and verses 4 and 6. This is the death of the livestock plague. The Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that the Israelites own will die. And the Lord set a time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. The Lord did this thing the next day. All the Egyptians' livestock died, but none among the Israelite livestock died. Chapter 9 and verse number 26, with the hail, the only place it didn't hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Chapter 10 and verse 23, the plague of darkness. One person could not see another. This is talking about the Egyptians, and for 3 days they did not move from where they were. Yet all the Israelites had light where they lived. And finally, chapter 11 and verse 7, leading up to the plague of the firstborn. But against all the Israelites, whether people or animals, not even a dog will snarl, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. What is this showing to the Egyptians? That if you want to be highly favored, you need to serve this God. Your gods are not going to do anything for you. But look at the care and the love that he has for his people. And that just shows that God, though he is showing great feats of power, he's not out of control. He's not just throwing his weight around. No, he is very pointed on what he's doing. And his people, his covenant people, they are going to be protected. This family that is growing up and that is soon going to be delivered, this new covenant, the law of Moses, and put it in that covenant, they're going to be protected. They're going to be cared for. Again, Alan, as you mentioned earlier, this just makes any sort of unfaithfulness, any sort of distrust on behalf of the people absolutely mind-blowing. How could they do such a thing when the Lord had been so good to them?
Yeah, we'll get onto them a few more times, I think, over the next couple of
but of course,
weeks.
I'm sure we'll mention this, that we probably, though we might be hard on them, we should not be unaware of our own obstinance at times. The fact that we find ourselves in the exact same position, that the Lord has been so good to us, and yet oftentimes we even find ourselves unfaithful and distrusting in his promises. Go ahead, Alan.
I want to focus now, I think, on the last two, the darkness and the death of the firstborn, just because there's a really cool connection, I think, with the New Testament. The darkness, it mentions, the stretch out your hand in verse 21. Moses stretched out his hand, verse 22, and there was darkness throughout the land for 3 days. Person could not see one another for 3 days. They did not move from where they were. Of course, the Israelites still had light. Pharaoh still was unwilling to let them go. So it necessitated this last one. But I find it, I made this connection that, of course, anytime there's so 3 days, that's, curious. There's a lot of threes throughout the Bible. And do you remember another time where there was darkness over the face of the earth or the face of the land for a time? Well, I think of right before the death of Christ. It says in Matthew, from noon until 3, there was darkness over the land. So for 3 hours, there was darkness. And what followed that darkness? Well, it was the death of the firstborn. So you're starting to see, obviously, with the Passover chapter coming up as well, there's so many parallels to Christ and his sacrifice and everything. And we'll get to that more, but we're already starting to see one. Well, when you're looking at it from reading Matthew or the Gospels, you're hopefully starting to look back now. If you haven't already, the Lord's Supper had already occurred at this point when Jesus is on the cross. So you're already looking back to this time and seeing the comparisons of Jesus to things in the book of Exodus, but just another connection with Christ being the firstborn. That's not necessarily mentioned as much. We're told he's obviously the firstborn of his family, of Joseph. That's what he was considered, the firstborn of his father. But I don't know if it necessarily mentions at that point that he's the firstborn of his father. So just another connection there with him being the firstborn and the death of that firstborn, which kind of makes it interesting because that would kind of equate Jesus with a plague in a sense. But I mean, who is that plague going to be against? That plague, the death of the firstborn, is not going to be against God's people. That plague will affect those that are against him. Right. And I mean, what better description of the cross? I mean, if you've not been baptized, if you're not part of Christ, then that cross is a symbol of death to you, because I mean, that's just going to quicken your journey to the opposite of heaven, basically. If you're a part of God's people, then you can be saved. That cross is a symbol of salvation. His death is it's everything. His death and resurrection. First Corinthians, that's everything to a Christian. Well, if you're not a Christian, then what is that? That's a symbol of your own death coming if you do not submit to Christ. So starting to see some interesting parallels, especially with that final plague coming up.
Yeah, and so many of these plagues, as we're looking, of course, the people are being affected, the magicians are being affected, and the priests of the Egyptian religion are being affected. But how is Pharaoh being affected at this point? Reality is he probably still has everything that he wants. No, he might not be able to see, and no, there are many ways in which he's being affected by these things as well. We read that many of these plagues, the flies, the gnats, they are all in Pharaoh's palace. But when is the true turning point? When does he really push everybody out? Well, that's going to happen whenever his very family is affected in the worst way, with the death of his firstborn, which is coming up. But even throughout all this, I'm back in chapter 11 now. Back in chapter 11, let's see here, chapter 11 and verse number 9. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you. This is after he's talked about what's going to happen, about how these firstborn are going to die. He says, but Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron did all the wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of the land until when? Until this happens. And as you mentioned, it's really cool. I've never noticed the sets of threes here, which of course 3 times 3 leads you up to 9. That leaves this one plague to stand by itself, to be really the pinnacle of the plagues that are given against Egypt. And it is not just going to be a plague, and that's what's so cool about what happens here within the text. This is not just something that matters here in Egypt, but this is going to be an event that is going to be symbolic, going forward in Scripture into the law, and even reference some in Hebrews, I believe. And this is going to be such an important event, a impactful event that is going to be remembered not just for generations, but for hundreds and even thousands of years. And that's what we're going to talk. We're going to save that for our next study, so we can look in a little more depth here at the Passover. Alan, do you have anything else that you want to share with our audience this evening? Anything that you have not been able to talk about that you would study for? I think I mentioned really what I wanted to talk about, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, that theme that's shown here, and then the care for Israel, that theme that's traced throughout here as well.
Just another connection with Christ. This event, the plagues, and then of course the deliverance, the Exodus through the Red Sea, and that deliverance there. These 2 events are probably the most talked about or most referenced throughout. Really the rest of Scripture, just because the New Testament's so short, they don't have enough time to talk as much about Christ. But how often will the plagues be mentioned whenever another plague happens? And it's usually, just like the plagues that affected Egypt. And then I'm the Lord who delivered you out of the land of Egypt. That phrase is, repeat throughout the Bible. So this is such a pivotal event. And again, to equate that with the most pivotal event, which is just the coming of Christ and his sacrifice. What does he do leading up to, for 3 years? What does he do leading up until his death? Well, he does signs and wonders. We've looked at all these and we've called them plagues, but a lot of times it's just mentioned as sign or wonder. And God sent Moses, and he says, all these signs, all these wonders. He doesn't say, I'm sending all these plagues against Egypt. I'm sending you with all these signs and wonders.
That's right. Chapter 11 and verse 9. That's what he says. Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt.
And yes, we can describe them as plagues because that's what they are. But that, if we call them wonders, then that really gives the purpose, like we said, that they may know. They may understand, not just the Israelites, just the Egyptians, but throughout these couple of chapters, it's your sons and your grandsons that they may know, and your generations later they may know that these things happened and why and what purpose. Well, that's what Jesus did. He did all these signs and wonders. I think for a slightly different reason, that those people, those of us that read about those events today, that we may know that he is the Son of God, that God sent him. So he didn't cast any plagues on anyone. I think what happened when the one of the towns rejected him, and the apostles were like, "Oh, want us to rain fire down on him," and he rejected that idea. So, a little bit different.
A little bit, guys. Y'all need to calm down, simmer down.
These were very negative signs and wonders. Well, Jesus is healing. He's doing the opposite of signs and wonders. So just an even better situation there. But he does them just the same. And then, of course, with the Passover and the death of the firstborn, we'll see even more parallels with Christ, or more ultimate fulfillments when Christ comes and shows those events to be even more perfect than what happens here.
Right. Great stuff, Alan. I know, again, we do this study because we want to help others. We want to give others the opportunity to study the Bible and to maybe see things they haven't seen before, to be reminded of things they have seen before. But so often I am reminded of how beneficial this is for myself. If not a single person watched this, which we're thankful, we normally have a great number of viewers that watch this study. But even if no one else watched this study, I benefit so much from it, from going through, from reading the text afresh and making connections I've never seen before. And it's just been so beneficial for me. And I hope it's been the same for you, brother, that you've seen things you haven't seen, been reminded of things you have seen, and you're able to see the text in a light that, again, what we talk about often is we want to present this study in such a way that we come to deepen our understanding in God, because we believe that a deeper understanding in God gives way to a deeper trust and a deeper faith in God, so that we can be more obedient to him and more faithful to him in all that we do. Alan, thank you so much for your participation in our study, leading our minds in these great thoughts this evening. And thank you to all of our viewers, whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube, for joining in with us today. Hope that you have been blessed as well. We'll be back on here. Go ahead.
Real quick. Well, I was just going to say, by the way, Nick's posted all of these videos on a separate YouTube page. Pretty easy. Once you get to that page, then they're all in order, episode numbers and everything. So our idea, and I appreciate Nick. I mean, Nick's been doing most of the electronic work, so he gets all the props for organizing all that too. So props to him. But the goal, like he said, is we want this to be a resource that people can go back and reference for their own Bible classes, or just to share. I mean, I speak for both of us. We're trying to teach the truth, and these are difficult passages sometimes, but I think they're important to learn. So these are great things. If you're having a Bible study, or someone you're talking with, say, hey, look at these are some guys from church. Watch the video. Let's talk about it. Great. I think hopefully they can be great evangelistic tools as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for plugging that, Alan. Yeah, you go to YouTube and search Walking Through History. Do it all together without separating the words, and then you can search it that way, and it will pop up pretty quickly. Just because it is a brand new, very small channel, it might be hard for you to find, but I might even get that link posted somewhere here on Facebook where we can share that with people. But thank you again so much, Alan, for sharing that, bringing that to people's attention. Thank you for joining us, and hope that you'll continue to be blessed in our studies, which we'll pick up again on Tuesday, probably be around 5:00 again, as we continue to work our way throughout the story that is found within Exodus, as we look at the Passover and what happens following these first 9 plagues. A very significant event takes place here in Genesis chapter 12, and we want to give full attention to that significance, because it does play a big part moving forward in the story. But also want to let you know that Sunday we're not going to be meeting here at Pleasant Plains again in person for worship service, because unfortunately the conditions in Jackson continue to grow worse by the day. I ask that you please be praying for us here in Jackson. Be praying for the medical workers. Be praying for those who are sick and their families. that hopefully things can turn around quickly so we can gather together again. But in lieu of that, we'll be having a study this Sunday morning at 11 a.m. And we're going to be talking about trying to answer the question, shall we debate? Should we have spiritual discussions? Should we have debates and discussions around religious topics? Actually, a debate is taking place currently this week in Amarillo, Texas, I believe it is, at a church with a good friend of mine, a fellow preacher is engaged in a debate. I want to talk about whether or not that's a good thing. And if it is a good thing, why is it a good thing? How can it be a good thing? That's going to be the topic of discussion this upcoming Sunday at 11 a.m. here on the Pleasant Plains Facebook page, on the Pleasant Plains Facebook page, and then also on a YouTube channel. That's just my name, Nick Angel. You should hopefully be able to find that. I'll post that link somewhere as well. Again,
I'll be doing a rebuttal at 12 o'clock to whatever you say. I'll do the rebuttal.
Well, just make sure you do everything as I say. That way it is beneficial.
So I'm curious to see where you land so I can, take the other viewpoint.
It is not good that you're a humble. You ought to be arrogant, just like Pharaoh, is what we'll hear at 12 o'clock.
Here we go.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your Friday evening. May God bless you in all that you do. I hope you know that he loves you. I hope you know that we love you, and we want nothing but to be a blessing to you in this study. But take care. Hope you'll join us soon. God bless.